Pride of Detroit PODcast, continuing on to the next part of our draft coverage. And we should just go right down the order here on day two, at least for the next three in this segment. Let's start with Sam LaPorta, because this pick doesn't get made without the Lions trading back from 12. And I think we ran a poll during the break with our Twitch audience about alternative draft classes, and we had a bit of an argument of, do you include LaPorta in there for top two for day one? Because he gets included because of the pick at 34. Granted, chosen over interior offensive lineman Steel Avila, who went at 2 picks later. But this is really fascinating for the Lions. I guess there was a need at tight end, and even on the rookie contract, I found this fascinating. For all 4 guys, tie all their tight ends together, and you're paying half of about less than half of what you would for TJ Hawkinson. And it's another tight end from Iowa. Iowa didn't have a great offense. Sam LaPorta was that offense. Fascinating, Jeremy. They took LaPorta over several other tight ends here. They took him over Notre Dame's Michael Mayer, and they took him over Georgia's Darnell Washington, who fell really hard in this draft for according to Albert Breer, a medical issue. So, I think there's some holes in LaPorta's game, especially in blocking. But where do you take this pick, and do you have any problems with him being I think he would have been the second tight end off the board?
He was, yeah.
Yes.
Listen, I didn't do a ton of scouting on the other tight ends, but I knew that tight end was a need for this team. I didn't buy that they were fine with Brock Wright and James, just basically like that entire group of like unproven guys. And everyone's like, oh, but they got 8 touchdowns. Yeah, that's all that they did though. Like, they didn't catch any other passes, and that was all like schemed up pretty well. It wasn't like these guys were offensive weapons. Sam LaPorta is an offensive weapon. Like, he is a phenomenal player. I am as soon as I hit the tape of this guy, I'm like, the Lions just got themselves a glorified, like a huge wide receiver. That's who they got. And part of that is surprising to me, right? I thought if they were going to go tight end, they might favor someone who's more of a two-way guy. I'm not saying LaPorta can't block, but I think it's something that definitely he needs to work on. Certainly not as a mentality. The Lions got another Iowa captain, so you don't have to worry about his character. You don't have to worry about any of that. But he's quick. He's got great hands. He can go up and get contested catches. He'll catch over the middle. He'll catch in the slot. I will use this guy everywhere. In line, out wide, in the backfield, through screens to him, through reverses to him. Like, this is a guy that you can do a heck of a lot with. And so we talked a little bit in the first segment about the offense not getting into regression. This is why. You now have 2 big passing weapons. And I know a lot of Lions fans wanted them to go wide receiver in this draft, and they waited until the 7th round to do it. They're fine now. Like, I am very happy with the offensive weapons they have, and Sam LaPorta is going to be a huge part of that. And so I'm fully on board. Like, throw positional value out the window here, because, again, this guy is going to be more of a receiver than a blocker, and I think he's going to be a mismatch, a huge mismatch. And that's what you look for in that. Like, the best tight ends in this game, the ones that get all of the accolades, they do a little bit of blocking, but mostly they're a huge mismatch that you can't find guys to block them. Who are you going to find to cover a guy that big? And again, like, not big as an inline tight end, but big as an outside wide receiver. You're not going to find anyone that fast. I'm all aboard on this pick. This is probably my favorite pick in the draft.
I think you bring up something interesting too, because I know I had mentioned Sam LaPorta's name several times in kind of our lead up to draft coverage during our mock draft seasons and everything. And I always got a really nonplussed answer from Lions fans. And I think this is absolutely some name recognition stuff, just because I think we had highlighted certain other tight ends like Dalton Kincaid and Darnell Washington, that when it got to LaPorta, I think the first blush was, I don't know much about this guy, or I didn't really like him because he just wasn't on the radar. Some of what we do with draft coverage is still about name recognition. But Ryan, I know you were the big Darnell Washington proponent. I know he fell pretty hard here. How did you feel about LaPorta?
Yeah, so LaPorta was a pick that was made while I was in the middle of a track meet where it was raining sideways, so I was already kind of in like a bad mood. So to see the Lions take a tight end and have it not be Darnell Washington, um, it bummed me out. But again, I needed to go back, and I suggest everybody go back and look at all of the stuff that Iowa was able to do with LaPorta, and they were able to do it with maybe the worst quarterback in college football. Petrus was just awful, abysmal, terrible. But like Jeremy said, this was a guy that he was the Iowa offense. Like this is and to think about a guy, right, who, I mean, he had 58 catches last season for 657 yards. To think that he was the focal point, right? Like he's getting all the attention. Now think about Sam LaPorta when you have to think about Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery and JMO and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like, this is a guy that if Ben Johnson can scheme open Brock Wright, if he can scheme open, James Mitchell coming back from an ACL injury, you have to think that a guy as athletic as Sam LaPorta, Ben Johnson can do some extra fun things with.
Athletic, right? And big, real big.
Athletic, big, and run after the catch, right? Like run after the catch in a way that he's determined to not go to the ground, right? And
unlike TJ Hawkinson.
Yes, I was going to say, what's one thing that a lot of Lions fans really dogged Hawkinson on? It was him ducking out of bounds. It was him, going down. LaPorta does not go down until you bring him down, which, okay, that's gotten George Kittle in a little bit of trouble when it comes to injuries and the such. But I think you have a guy who's just really tough. And that was something that was in Brugler's Beast too, is like, okay, he might not be TJ Hawkinson or Noah Fant levels of talent, but he is tough like Kittle's tough.
Yeah.
And I think you combine that toughness with the interesting things that he can do athletically. I'm fine with the pick. It will come under heavy scrutiny, right? Because of the names that Chris listed. Mayer goes the very next pick. The Packers take a couple of tight ends,
right?
In Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft. But I think with LaPorta, I'm happy that the Lions didn't just sit on their hands. I'm glad that they said, hey, this guy could be a difference maker for us, and we're going to get him.
Yeah. Well, two things. Like, just to go along with what you said, the two words that came out of Brad Holmes' mouth when he was describing LaPorta was gritty weapon. Exactly what you said. Like a guy who is going to fight for those extra yards and is going to be able to, because our good friend Peter Bukowski posted a really interesting chart that put avoided tackles on the x-axis and their 10-yard split on the 40 on the y-axis. Literally, the furthest top right you can get is Sam LaPorta. And that's with guys like George Kittle on the graph, David Njoku, Mark Andrews, Luke Musgrave. He was showing like, oh, look how good Luke Musgrave was. Sam LaPorta was way, like, even better than he was. And so I think this is a pick you can get very, very excited about.
Let's talk a little bit about the next pick here. And probably one of my favorite picks in this draft. It's someone I really thought the Lions could have got at 18. I think, actually, we were talking about this, Jeremy. We weren't even sure he'd be available at 18.
Right.
Instead, the Lions get him in I'm sorry, what was the pick number again? 48?
That's 45. They moved up
45,
from 48 so they trade up to
That's right. I forgot about that completely. And that is Alabama safety Brian Branch. By the way, your first bite series is going to have a little less work this year, considering you just got to double up on Alabama and Iowa.
Yeah.
But look, for as much as the Lions got chided for value for their first three picks in the trifecta of tight end, linebacker, and running back, people like this for the value because Brian Branch isn't just a safety. He can line up anywhere. He is almost a pure DB. You can put him in the slot. You can put him in the nickel. He's a really fascinating prospect in that regard. And yet at the same time, Jeremy, I don't know how much you will see in year one just because of how active the Lions were in free agency in getting guys like CJ Gardner-Johnson to load up their defensive backfield.
Well, yeah, and this goes back to the point I made in the first segment, which is like this draft was a good balance of need now and needs later. Brian Branch.
And this is why I also said file off the serial numbers on where these guys get picked, because Branch, great value at the top of the draft kind of guy.
Right. And the thing I really like about Brian Branch is that, one, he's physical, right? It's the crazy amount of tackles for loss he had at nickel. It's the willingness to be there in the run game and hit people in the pass game. And then the smarts. I really feel like the Lions have really prioritized just cerebral players in the secondary now. You get Cam Sutton, you get CJ Gardner-Johnson, you get Emmanuel Mosley. All these guys are being hailed for how smart they are. And so the learning process is going to be quick for this guy. And I think by the end of the season, whether there's injury or not, you're going to see this guy on the field for something. They're going to get him out there. And because he has that physical nature, he's going to get out there on special teams right away. And he even said in his opening Zoom conference with us on the night of the draft, like, if that's how I got to get on the field, that's what I'm going to do. But this now gives you a bunch of leverage in the CJ Gardner-Johnson, contract disputes, if there is one next year. It gives you wiggle room where you don't have to overpay him, and maybe you play the like if CJ Gardner-Johnson balls out again this year, gets paid a boatload, well, suddenly you get a 3rd round pick in return theoretically, and you just spend a 2nd round on his replacement. That's like you just got cheaper, younger at the position, and you almost lost no draft capital doing it. Like that is that's probably the ideal scenario here. I don't know if it's going to work out that way. I'm not saying like now that you have Brian Branch, you can throw CJ Gardner-Johnson out. I don't think they're going to necessarily do that, because I think, like you said, they can use Brian Branch in a lot of different ways. But it's just, to me, it's exciting to have so many smart guys in the secondary and so many versatile guys in the secondary that you can shake things up a heck of a lot. And now you finally got Aaron Glenn with a bunch of tools in his tool belt, and I'm ready to see him cook. It's going to be exciting.
Yeah, the thing I love about Brian Branch, you kind of hit on it. It's the idea that you want to do something in zone, Brian Branch can do it. You want to do something in man, Brian Branch can do it. And the one other thing that you need to hit home on is, like, the guy is smart. He doesn't have the athleticism of some other big time safeties, right? But he has the smarts to end up with 27 passes defended in his college career, right? He led Alabama in interceptions last year, which is a pretty impressive stat for a guy who you would say doesn't have the kind of requisite athleticism that you would want from a player of that position, but he more than makes up for it with his smarts, his tackling ability too, right? Like what was the stat? It was under 2% missed tackles.
Right.
Oh my God. Talk about an Aaron Glenn, Dan Campbell guy to a T.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say something too about the speed and the measurables on him too. Like, yeah, I know he didn't do great at the 40-yard. People are chiding him because he had about a 4.6. I talked with Kent on draft night, and one of the things that he brought up, and I think maybe John echoed this as well, but also, like, you look at, you don't really need 40-yard time for safety. What you're looking at, and where he did do well, scored well, was on the 10-yard split, was on just the short, quick, explosive areas. And that's where you're really looking on a safety. So I don't even think he's he's not as bad of an athletic specimen that people are making him out to be either. Because maybe he can't run a 40 time very well, but he's got that short yardage explosive that you just really want in a defensive back.
And the one other thing that I want to add about this, and I think it goes back to the idea of positional value, is that it seems like there's always like one of these defensive backs in recent memory. There's been a couple that stick out to me that, like, there's, they're either safety or slot corners. Like there's Daxton Hill the other year. Some of the other names are escaping me, but these guys that they get talked about as being like, oh yeah, they'll be like middle of the first round, maybe like early 20, and then they always slip to the second round. And maybe the writing was on the wall with Brian Branch in that respect. But I just find it funny, right, that the Lions, they get Brian Branch, who admittedly, right, the first 3 picks, you can make an argument for those guys immediately getting put on the field, right?
Yep.
Like there really isn't anybody impeding them from their role.
Right.
Brian Branch is the first guy that you're like, Well, CJ Gardner-Johnson's ahead of him.
Right.
Right. But they get him at 45. So it's like you didn't spend 12 because you wanted to reach and get a guy who, hey, quote unquote, might be better for you 2, 3, 4 years down the road. You get a guy who, yeah, he gives you leverage in the CJGJ talks, like you mentioned, Jeremy. You get a guy who's going to contribute, but he's not going to get the snap count that some of these other guys got, but you got him all the way at 45. Yeah. There's the value, right? It's not the value. It's not the value of not getting him in the first round. It's what you're getting out of him based on where you're drafting him.
And now we come to the core of some of the value talk. As the Lions traded back up to get to the start of the third round.
Trade back.
Trade back. Did they? Oh my God.
They traded back twice.
Yes. I lost track of how much the Lions moved around. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I should let you guys get to this first because I feel like I have some thoughts. Because on one hand, I was riding this guy a lot on the reputation that I think fans were giving him, and I dread some of the reputation fans will give him. And I can hear those call-ins to radio already, almost reminiscent of the Kellen Moore Stafford days about just give him a chance. But people lauded this for the value, taking Tennessee Volunteers quarterback Hendon Hooker at the start of the third round, a prospect that some people were insisting was a day one talent, was a day one guy. Just give him the ball. He knows how to win games. The talent is undoubtedly there. It's fascinating watching the idea of Hendon Hooker. So I'm going to shut up because I have a lot of thoughts on it. I feel like I'm teeing up a lot of these. So if you will permit me to to bookend this one, I want to get your thoughts on Hendon Hooker.
Well, let me start first I'm going to plug my own other podcast. I'm sorry. But the reason I'm doing it is because it's literally already on this podcast feed. It is literally, you could download 4 minutes. I talked to Mark Schofield, who I think is one of the biggest draft experts on quarterbacks specifically. I asked him a very simple question. Will Hendon Hooker be the long-term backup, or does he have a legitimate shot to unseat Jared Goff? And to answer very quickly, very shortly, his answer was, this guy has the upside to be your franchise quarterback. He'll talk about it more. I'm just teasing our own podcast, Ryan. You can come back. But the one thing I will say is that I find the timeline of this all very fascinating, right? Because he's just coming back from the ACL. He's starting to do some dropbacks. Will he be ready by training camp? I don't know. The Lions aren't willing to tell, but the way that they've treated injuries like this in the past is they are not going to push it. And there's no reason that they need to push it. But if they do view him as a franchise quarterback, I think the timing is a little awkward. Because by next offseason, you kind of have to make a decision on Goff. I don't know if Goff is just going to be willing to play on the final year of his contract, especially if the Lions ball out this year. We've been talking about it all offseason, Ryan, right? Like, if the Lions do what a lot of people are expecting them to do this year, they're going to win a playoff game, and Jared Goff is going to demand a lot of money. And he should, before going into that final year of his contract. If the Lions have to make a decision right then and there, are they going to have a good evaluation of Hendon Hooker? A guy who was injured through all of training camp and has a long developmental curve, given that he's coming from a very raw, non-NFL style offense at Tennessee? I don't know. I mean, maybe you can say, sorry, Goff, we're not going to do it. Play out your final year until we figure out who Hendon Hooker is, if he can be this guy. But I think the timing of it is very weird and interesting, and I don't know if it plays to the Lions' favor. I don't think it plays necessarily to Hendon Hooker's favor, unless he's further along in his rehab than maybe I think.
I don't want to read too much into it, but I think when you combine the ACL injury with the value of the third round pick, okay, and I know historically there's a lot of data that shows that day 2 quarterbacks, they're not worth the sheet of paper that you end up filling out their name on, okay? I think the interesting thing with Hendon Hooker is that you get a guy who's injured and he can basically medically redshirt that first year.
Right.
Okay. And it's a guy who, like Jeremy just said, he has so much playbook and so much offense to learn at the NFL level that you want to redshirt him. You don't want him on the field, and that's why to my argument, like I think the Lions still need to be in the backup quarterback market, and that's why I think Teddy Bridgewater still makes a ton of sense, because if you can bring in Teddy Bridgewater, what better guy to help learn from than Teddy Bridgewater? You got Jared Goff in that room. You got Ben Johnson in that room. You know, we'll see the kind of coaching chops on Mark Brunell, right? Like that's something I heard you brought up as well, Jeremy, because a lot of people ask that question, like how much of Goff's success is linked to Mark Brunell? Well, we're going to find out, because he's got a guy in Hendon Hooker that, you know, he can really develop. And that's the thing, right? He's a third round pick because the development suggests he can become somebody that you can feel comfortable with being your quarterback.
Yeah.
I do find the timing interesting, like you do as well, Jeremy, because they play through this year with Goff. They get to the other side of it. The decision has to be made. I don't think Jared Goff is playing out the last year of that contract. It gives the Lions a leg up. And it would be remiss of me as somebody who over the past 2 draft seasons has said, look, if the Lions want to get a head start on the quarterback thing and not be stuck with their pants down around their ankles, they should draft a guy that they feel like they can develop. I don't think that player was going to be the Brock Purdy, right? So I'm kind of glad that the Lions let Aiden O'Connell and Tanner McKee and Clayton, like all those guys pass by them.
Yep.
If they were going to get a guy, as much as I've been against Hendon Hooker, I think it makes the most sense.
I agree. And this is kind of what I've been on all off season. Like, I didn't think they were going to trade up to get one of the top guys. I thought it was probably risky to trade up, so I didn't want that. And then, yeah, I thought the bottom of this class was trash. I don't know why so many of them got drafted, but I didn't think there was going to be a Brock Purdy type in this draft class. So that just kind of left you with Hendon Hooker. But I thought, obviously, 18 was too early for him. I was kind of wishy-washy on 48 when that was the only, second round pick that they had at the time. It makes a ton of sense to me at the top of the third round, because it is that kind of medium ground where I think the floor is you have a decent backup for the next 4 years, hopefully beyond that. The ceiling is much, 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 much higher than that. And that's worth to me the third round risk. Like, because in that third round, you're not always getting a starter. In fact, you're normally not getting a starter. You're normally getting a role player. And a backup quarterback is a role player. A backup quarterback is a role player. And when you consider the upside, you want to talk about positional value. If you can get a star out of your quarterback in the third round, like, you just hit the positional value jackpot. So I'm fully on board with this pick. I think it's exciting to have also just a dual threat quarterback, because he gives you something different, right? I think Justin Rogers likes to make this point a lot. Like, yeah, you could bring in a backup who's just going to give you a crappier version of what you already have on the field. That's not very exciting. It usually doesn't win you games. But when you can put out a guy who brings an extra dynamic that your starter can't even, well, suddenly the defense has to adjust on the fly. And I like putting that sort of stress on the defense with someone like Hendon Hooker. So I'm all aboard on this pick. It's not a home run necessarily, but I think it's a very smart, calculated risk.
Well, damn, I messed up by waiting as much because I think you hit on all my points. I really didn't like the idea of Hooker before this draft because of this trinary like hit of college system, age, ACL, and somehow instead he falls all the way to the third round, which is fine. Like, as you said, like if his floor is just QB2, that's fine, because the Lions have never really, we're talking like since Sean Hill, since they really had a guy who you could say, yeah, that is your career backup here. He's someone who's not just going to hold the clipboard, but be able to come in and do it competently. And the upside is anywhere between bridge quarterback to franchise quarterback. I don't know if I really even buy franchise quarterback out of him, just because that transition he's got to make is really difficult. Sure. And it's a lot of guys have tried to make that transition and failed, or they just haven't really been much of it. And I like that's kind of why I've always favored Richardson, because with the full read progressions he can do. But with this kind of value that's fallen to you here, and I think some fans are, again, way too quick after a season and like 3-4 games of Jared Goff to anoint him as the unquestionable. I'm curious how much that changes now that Hendon Hooker is in town. I'm really curious how much that changes considering all the hype around Hendon Hooker, considering the cult of I don't want to say personality, but the cult of quarterback that drew up around him because of what he was at Tennessee, because of what he was in this draft process, to what people believe in him, how much that loyalty really changes. And I'm curious for the Lions themselves, because on one hand, I've already seen kind of rumblings of extension for Jared Goff. And I think, to your point, guys, it would fit with the timeline. But I think by the time they have to make that timeline, I think they'll have a better idea of what they have in Hooker and can decide on that. And again, third round. You're not talking about blowing a first round on someone like if he turns out like a Trey Lance kind of guy where it just doesn't work for you, then like, so what? It was the third round.
Yeah. And again, I think the most important part of all of this is that it gives the Lions a contingency plan. And what do we know Brad Holmes does for this roster, right? He creates contingency plans. Even if, say Jared Goff isn't the future of the Detroit Lions, might not be Hendon Hooker.
Or if he doesn't want an extension, he wants to go somewhere else in free agency. Just because he seems to like Detroit right now doesn't mean he's going to come back necessarily.
Right. And yeah, exactly. So I'm just saying that, like, even if Hendon Hooker isn't the quarterback, right, they at least have an option if they're going to go in a different route than Jared Goff. And the last thing I'll say is that the thing that encourages me the most about the quarterback evaluation is that they got a guy who has different traits than Jared Goff, right? Like the athleticism, the deep ball. You know, it's a guy who's a little bit different than Jared Goff in a number of ways, where I was concerned that Brad Holmes had blinders on when it came to quarterback evaluations. So
that's a good point, right? Because he hasn't really drafted a quarterback like this when he was in LA, and you thought maybe that he preferred the pocket present. I mean, this team has a lot of old school mentality, and you kind of wondered if maybe they thought the same at quarterback, but this proves they're open to it.
I feel like with the weapons they're getting to, it would fit if they did have to go to Hendon Hooker at some point. Doesn't a pass catching running back and a new tight end, that does feel like that fits like what Hendon Hooker could really work with there too.
And also, it's just kind of exciting to have a different quarterback in town too.
It
right?
is. It is. It really is. I just hope that excitement doesn't. I just hope that excitement doesn't tilt over into the first time Jared Goff struggles, people are calling for Hendon Hooker to start over him.
Sharpening my pitchfork.
I know,
it's
man.
Bound to happen, and
we did it with Kellen Moore over Matt Stafford. It will happen with Goff and Hooker.
Not we.
Yeah, hold on.
Hold on. You are part of Metro Detroit. You bear this sin as well.
Absolutely not.